debates. And also on our online function, you can use the Q&A form to send questions to our speakers. Today we're looking at the transatlantic bond and asking how can a close US-German relationship play a pioneering role in the European Union. Now joining me to discuss that we have Peter Bayer, CDU, member of the German Bundestag and importantly coordinator of transatlantic cooperation in the German Federal Foreign Office, and from Microsoft the Vice President of European Government Affairs, Kasper Klinge. Now the world has changed, our focus has shifted, and I'm wondering, are our priorities still the same as they ever were? So give us your opening statement, Peter, your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and the hi goes to Kasper as well, and to everybody who's listening or watching. It's wonderful to set up this topic in this video session today because it's important. Not only are we short of a new presidential, and I should add congressional election in the United States of America with possibly changes, maybe not, but independent from that, I think it is our responsibility on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'm sitting here in Berlin in Germany, so I have a little bit of focus in the perspective from Germany and Europe. It's our responsibility to be prepared for our own future and to shape it. So what does that mean? I think everybody should have understood by now that no single nation alone can face and manage the challenges that we are dealing with on a global scale. Migration, climate change, the rise of China. So for me, it is almost a no-brainer to join forces, to intensify the cooperation with the friends, with the allies across the Atlantic. Speaking of the United States of America, it has been difficult over the past almost 4 years to cooperate. But I think, again, and I underline that intentionally, that we don't have the luxury of wasting any more time to wait for something to happen in Washington, D.C., or something not to happen. So Trump 2 or Joe Biden 1. It is our responsibility to make offers to ourselves, to make offers to our allies within NATO, within the European Union, to the American friends, and to the Canadian friends, I should add as well. That means that we should identify where are our interests, where is our foundation of values, and how do we want to live in the future? Where do we want to stand? Obviously, we Germans and Europeans sometimes feel like we're squeezed in between the superpower in the West, the Americans, and the People's Republic of China in the East. And of course, there are some temptations with regard to market access, with regard to big business in China, with over 1.3, 1.4, even more billion people, citizens living there. It's a huge market for everyone who wants to have a piece of the cake. But think about it for a moment. Do we really want, at a not too far in the future point in time, be forced to live by not Western standards, but to allow and to accept in a world where intellectual property, respect for intellectual property is not really on the agenda, is not really important? What about environmental protection? What about human rights? Only some of the values that we share with the American friends. So to me, I think the agenda, a positive transatlantic cooperation agenda for the future, should be based on this solid fundament of shared values, but also shared interest. Over the past several years, we have forgotten a little bit about the shared interest that we're having. Again, it's not easy during the Trump administration times, but the interests are there. So what does it mean? If I should identify some of the future fields of more intensified cooperation, I would say trade and economy. I would say sciences. I would say defense architecture, security architecture. I would, of course, identify a cooperation in the field of technology, 5G, 6G, just to identify some of them. To sum that up, bottom line is as much as polls in Germany say that Germans are very critical and are not very fond of the United States of America anymore, like it had been in former years and decades. It's our responsibility to lead, to make political decisions, and also in the business world to cooperate more closely together, do away with all this stupid protectionism across the Atlantic, open up our systems, our universes, and cooperate, because it's about peace, it's about stability, and even more so, it's about keeping the way we live, securing the way we live, and securing the relative prosperity that we share. I want to live in that world. I don't want to live in a world where, all these things that I identified earlier, that I stated with regard to human rights, freedom of speech, judicial systems, environmental protections, all this not so nice things do not have that standard that we share in the West. And with that, I will make a stop, and I'm happy to listen to Casper and to the audience a question. It's very good that you set that up. Thank you very much for that.
Help us frame this discussion over the next 3/4 of an hour or so that we have left to really try and deal with all these big issues. Sorry, Casper, I don't think we can hear you. So I'm just going to reframe our debate again. This is about the transatlantic bond. Now, I think it was interesting there to hear from Peter saying that actually we don't have time to wait for Trump 2 or Biden 1. But I mean, surely our approach to how we deal with our US allies is fundamentally determined by who is occupying the White House at any particular time. Peter, sorry, I'm pushing back on that a little bit. Can you elaborate a bit further before we come to Casper?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I keep getting these questions. What will change if Joe Biden takes over the Oval Office and sits there at this nice desk and everything? Will there be a change? What topics will remain on the transatlantic agenda? We can only judge on the past. Trump, we know what we get, I think. Joe Biden won. It's a little bit, of course, speculation, but just suppose Joe Biden takes over the seat in the Oval Office. I think 2% NATO security architecture will remain a topic with a high priority. Energy security, energy diversity, Nord Stream 2 will remain on the agenda. Several other things, troop reduction, for example, importantly here in Germany, will remain on the agenda. But, and I could add several more, but what I think would create something that is really needed for all the good things that I mentioned in my introductory remarks is create a much cooperative, friendlier environment. I would expect from a Joe Biden administration much better communication, respect for each other, and really a serious will to advance in joint cooperations, in joint dialogue, even in trade negotiations, for that matter. Not on January 21, but in the course of the term. That is needed. I think that's so much in the interest of both our peoples. But what we also can say is that in the description and also partially in analysis of the current status of the United States of America, both the Dems and the Reps, Trump and Biden, are almost on the same side. They say, the United States of America are playing a diminishing role in the world, but they find different ways to answer. Whereas Donald Trump says America first, and we need to strengthen the national state and do away with multilateralism. The answer of a Joe Biden presidency would certainly be strengthening the United States through a stronger involvement and stronger engagement in international organizations like the United Nations, like the WTO, going back to the Paris Climate Accord, joining again JCPOA, Iran. So we will have a more friendlier environment to actually do all these things that I addressed in my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Peter. Casper, now we'll come to you. I think we can hear you well enough now. Can you give me your opening thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And sorry about the
Nope.
sound confusion to begin with. And listen, I mean, it's great to be with you today, and good to see you again, Peter. We were together in Berlin not too many weeks ago. It's great to be online with you. Listen, I think I'm sort of representing a little bit of a person with a foot in each camp, because I do work for one of the big American technology companies. But as you can hear from my heavy accent, I am indeed European. I think we shouldn't hide the fact that, you know, the transatlantic relationship on the surface might look a little bit weaker today than it has been in the past. But to some extent, I actually think that we have sort of a schizophrenic transatlantic relationship for the time being, because on the surface, there is, let's say, tension. You have a lot of European leaders expressing more concerns about what is happening in the US. What I would say is, I think fundamentally below the surface, there is still a very strong transatlantic relationship. We saw it in the speech of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who said we might disagree from time to time with the sitting US administration, but fundamentally we have a historic relationship that is strong, based on the same set of values, etc. And if you want, Jennifer, me to sort of fast forward to one of the conclusions that I think is super important, is that regardless of what happens on the 3rd and 4th of November in the US, I think we are at a stage where the transatlantic relationship is so unbelievably important when you look at what is happening around the world. I think defending liberal democratic values, defending multilateralism, making sure that we build sort of a rules-based international system, that requires the leadership, in my view, of both the United States and Europe. So we need to really stick together. And because Peter is German, I actually wanted to perhaps mention a small anecdote from my personal life. Because 12 years ago, I was very lucky to get a fellowship by the German Marshall Fund. And that fellowship took me to the US, but instead of just traveling to New York and Washington, which is the, I think, typical destination for those of us who've been working on transatlantic relations, it actually took me around the US in different states. And I spent a week in Nebraska living with a soybean farmer. And that was really an eye-opener for me, in the sense that it showed the diversity of the United States. It actually also showed me the diversity of Europe, because I was traveling together with a group of 30 Europeans from all over Europe, different backgrounds, etc. And it really made me realize both that we need to invest in that relationship, but it also made me realize that we have to make sure that we educate the next generation to build bridges between the US and Europe. And I think that's now a role where we have to rely on political leaders like Peter. The German presidency of the European Union, I think we'll come back to that, in my view, will play an incredibly important role in steering Europe in the right direction, maintaining a very strong relationship across the pond. But I also think that civil society, Jennifer, what you represent, academia, media, but also the private sector, has a responsibility in this. And that's certainly something where we as Microsoft, we are an American company, but we've been in Europe for many decades, all the way back to 1983. And I think we feel the responsibility for making sure that we do our part to build bridges and to make sure that decision makers on both sides of the Atlantic understands the other side. And that's certainly something which is an important part of my work as well. Thanks.
Well, let's start where any good negotiation should start, and finding those areas of commonality. Casper, can you be specific? I mean, you say we have a lot in common. I mean, where are we talking about where cooperation is strongest or needs to be strongest?
Yeah, it was interesting, as you know, Jennifer, before today's event, we did a small poll on Twitter where we asked our community to identify what areas are particularly important for the transatlantic relationship. And I was just watching the result before going on, and it might have changed, so apologies if I don't have the up-to-date facts. But it was interesting to me that the majority of people actually pointed towards sustainability as the area that is going to be incredibly important for transatlantic relations. Now, that's sweet music in my ears, because in fact, I think that's one of the very few, and it's wrong to say positive things about COVID-19, especially because of the situation we're in right now, which is so challenging. But I do think that COVID-19 has led us to an almost momentum around bringing together digitalization and sustainability as one of the main goals in Europe. And I think making sustainability, fighting climate change, a transatlantic priority is certainly something that we would sign up to behind. Interesting, I think second place was on technology. And I think that also demonstrates that we are in a world now where technology, including the technology that a company like Microsoft is providing, plays an incredibly important role in our ordinary lives. I think during COVID-19, we've seen how dependent we are on communicating like we are today when we can't be in the physical room together, which I very much regret, by the way. We've seen, education taking place online. We've seen how important machine learning and artificial intelligence is in finding a vaccine for COVID-19, and in reality, making sure that our economies will suffer less than they would otherwise do without these 21st century technologies. So I think the technology discussion, where there are differences of opinion across the Atlantic, that goes without saying, is going to be an important part. But I would actually say trust in many ways would be the single sort of parameter I think will be incredibly important to maintain and perhaps to expand and boost as we move into the next couple of months and years. Fundamentally, we have to make sure that the next generation of European leaders, the next generation of American leaders, have a fundamental trust in the other side, so that we do stick to basic human rights, defending democracy, privacy issues, security issues. I think those are going to be topics we need to invest more in.
I am going to come back to some of those topics indeed. But I want to put it to Peter. It's sort of something, Casper, you alluded to, that in some ways, although we're in the midst of this pandemic, sometimes crisis can be the mother of invention. Do you see any of that possibility coming from the COVID-19 situation vis-a-vis the transatlantic relationship?
Yes, I mean, reality was over the past, over half a year since we are in this pandemic situation, since like mid of March or so, that it is, of course, much more difficult than before, where the travel bans, the travel restrictions, we all cannot really meet. That is not really helpful with regard to really these absolutely necessary and important interpersonal relations. Usually in former years, I was always traveling once a month somewhere to the United States. So this year around, it was only once before, the travel bans and the pandemic hit in. So that makes it more difficult, really. But I totally agree that there is a chance. First, with regard to technology, a boost in, we were like forced to be educated in our conduct with digital devices. So digital education was really something that really got a boost. That is good. With regard to also a boost in identifying fields of transatlantic cooperation, I wish so. I cannot really confirm that has already taken place, because let's face it, everybody, all governments, all nations, all societies currently are so much dealing with their own situation, which is completely understandable. In Belgium, it's the same in the United States and Germany. So we're so much focused on ourselves. But that would be something that I think is important and should be mentioned, is we shouldn't make the mistake, what you hear all along, say, now we need to strengthen the national states and now cut off all the supply chain. And, it sounds to me like a big mistake trying to really cut down with globalizations in general. I think what we should learn from the pandemic is doing it the smart way. Yes, there are certainly fields of nationalization or personal equipment, protection equipment, for example, and maybe some others. But I think, again, I really want to emphasize that cooperation in sciences. During the pandemic, there were some negative examples actually across the Atlantic. For example, with regard to the vaccine, there are some made-up stories that were taken for real, like this CureVac thing that the Trump administration allegedly was, wanted to buy that company and all that stuff. There was a lot of fake news involved, but it sees how we are somehow prepared already to perceive these news as really real news. that sheds a light on the tensions across the Atlantic. But again, I said in the beginning, also over this year, in the course of this year, 5G, 6G, critical infrastructure and telecoms is a field of really high discussion politically and with regard to technology in my country here. And I've led many conversations about the issue with American friends. There's an interest, and I think that would be a wonderful field of transatlantic cooperation, 5G, 6G. Speaking of capabilities, personnel, technology, and I think we can really build something really positive there. And one last thing I may add, that when I listened to the remarks of Casper, I think also important to understand is we should not make the mistakes of the past. Here in Europe, we have taken the transatlantic relationship for granted for decades, and rested a little bit in our comfort zone and really didn't invest too much in that. We need to do that, and I'm not speaking only about money. Yes, also money should be involved, but we should. That's why I said earlier, protectionism, both in trade and economy, but also in technology, is not a smart approach. It would hurt both of our societies. That is a field where we should really, and we could do much more together.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question before I come back to Casper and ask him to expand on all those technological issues that we want to discuss today. I mean, you mentioned let's not make the mistakes of the past. What about new mistakes, like, for example, pulling out of the WTO, which seems an unusual, let's put it that way, thing to do in the midst of a current pandemic?
Of the WTO, WHO, you mean?
WHO, yes.
Did I miss something?
Sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's completely not understandable. We all know the arguments that the U.S. president mentioned. It's occupied by the Chinese and heavily influenced, and so on and so on. I mean, especially in a pandemic situation, we need to strengthen those international organizations who are there for global, to do something good for the global health situation. That is something that is completely not understandable. And as far as I heard that Joe Biden, if he becomes president, would certainly go back and become yet again a member of the WHO. So that is, I think that is completely a no-brainer, that we need to strengthen those organizations who try to act like the virus itself, which doesn't know any borders. It's global. It's a global phenomenon. And then you cannot find national answers, responses to that situation. We need WHO, and that is one of the mistakes. And when I was saying that we shouldn't make the mistakes of the past, I was also thinking about the TTIP times. Several mistakes had been made, and there was a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of ignorance involved. And there was also not enough cooperation between the political universe and the business, the economy, the business side. Both did their jobs and advocated in favor of TTIP and everything, but they really only in the very end, before it really, was over, did we understand we need to streamline somehow, work for the same goal. That was too late. People were, in my country especially, were so much against that. That is something that we should understand, that really there are fields of interest where the politicians and business people need to cooperate much closer together.
To cooperate on health, as you say, and in relation to something that knows no borders. But Casper, let's talk about something else that knows no borders, and that is the development of technology. The EU, and in particular Germany and the US, really do need to work together on a lot of the development of, say, for example, new AI. But in some ways, I'm thinking perhaps of the GDPR and things like that, don't we have a fundamentally different approach in how to manage these things?
Yeah, listen, I think that's a super good question. And if you allow me to use a little bit my dark past working for government until recently. It was interesting with the general data protection regulation discussions, especially the ones I was myself involved in it with US technology companies before joining Microsoft. And in the beginning, before GDPR came into effect, there was a lot of criticism, a lot of concerns about, is this de facto protectionism being rolled out in Europe? Is it anti-American in nature? I think that discussion is in a very different place today than it was even 2-3 years ago. We've seen, also states in the US, California, a state with a population half the size of Germany, 1/7 of the total population of the US, introducing legislation which is very, very close to what we have in Europe on GDPR. So we traditionally talk about the transatlantic relationship as being more focused on national security in the US, more focused on privacy issues in Europe. And I'm not saying here there are no differences. Of course, there are nuances in it. But, when you look at surveys on privacy in the US, interestingly enough, privacy comes out at the very top when you ask people, what are you concerned about? What do you think matters the most when you're using the new technologies, the platforms, social media, etc.? So what I'm trying to say, and I'm really trying to be diplomatic here, is that once in a while, my impression is we exaggerate the differences across the Atlantic. And I think when you combine the US and Europe, the differences with other places around the world is much greater than it is across the Atlantic. But of course, there are a couple of things, and just to jump ahead, I'm sure you might want to talk about data transfer and the recent Schrems II decision that came into effect, which put a number of question marks around how companies are able to transfer data between Europe and the US. I think the good thing about the outcome of that verdict is that the European Commission and the US government are working very closely together to try and find a way of making sure that there are appropriate measures in place that will guarantee the legal transfer of data between the US and Europe. I do also think that fundamentally there is an agreement across the Atlantic between decision makers that the free flow of data is an essential part of the global economy. It's an essential part of Europe's economy as well. And if you want me to be a little bit cheeky on this one, and I would love to get Peter's opinion about this. We discussed it a little bit in Berlin 2 weeks ago. But there is a lot of focus in Europe about industrial data and the dominance, if you like, of the quality of industrial data in Europe. I think what is important to add to that discussion is just that European industrial data is very much globalized industrial data. It doesn't really matter whether you're a car manufacturer in Germany or you're a wind turbine producer in Denmark. The data that comes to you doesn't only come from Europe, it comes from around the world. So we are all dependent on making sure the data can flow freely. And I think that will be the backbone, not only in the US economy and Europe's economy, but in fact in the global economy. What we have to make sure, and that's where the industry has an enormous responsibility, is that is handled in a safe, secure way that guarantees the highest standards of privacy for citizens, not least in Europe and the US, but also around the world.
Well, Casper, you've obviously been listening to Commissioner Thierry Breton's speeches lately. Peter, let's have your reaction to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to comment on that. Casper is absolutely right that we have the trustworthiness, the reliability, and the sheer practice of a free flow of data, not only industrial data, but other data as well in general, is so important for the societies and for the economies, for the businesses. We have a situation currently that is absolutely not desirable after the Schrems II decision by the European Code of Justice, which we have, of course, to respect. So it's really one of the really super important tasks of the EU Commission to cooperate and to negotiate it with the American friends, with the US administration, and I know that they are on it already, to not waste time, to find a way with regard to these issues, to those issues that the European Court of Justice criticized in its decision. That is, standards of security of these data. We need a quick but a substantially good agreement that will ensure the free flow of data across the big pond. There's a lot of uncertainty now, although the European Court of Justice said, the standard clauses are okay, but, it raised an eyebrow because except the standards in the United States are not okay. So it's a situation where nobody really knows how can we legally act when it comes to a exchange of data across the Atlantic. That is a situation that is not only not desirable, that is a no-go. So we need a quick but a substantially good answer to that, and an agreement between the United States of America and Europe very, very quickly to do away with this uncertainty. It's a situation that is completely unbearable. So that is the current situation we're in. There's also something going on, maybe prompted by the pandemic here, at least not prompted by, but got maybe a little bit boost, and also during the German Council Presidency, that is developing a European digital policy. So setting out a framework of standards, what we want to achieve with regard to data protection is one thing, but artificial intelligence, digital sovereignty, that we do the right thing, that we don't want to exclude others. I know there are some concerns on the sides of the American friends that, for example, this project Gaia-X, that wants to build up a digital infrastructure, will close out others. That needs to be open, that everybody can make offers and use that infrastructure. But I think what we want is build up what we understand when we talk about digital sovereignty in Europe is developing and building up capabilities, but a legal framework and technological capabilities, but not closing it down and closing the borders. We want access by the Microsofts and others of this world, and to use that infrastructure as well. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. That's what we want to achieve here.
I'm glad you brought it up, because I was going to put it to Casper, the question of the Gaia-X project, the so-called, in all those headlines, European cloud. How do you see it? I mean, there are allegations that it is a sort of protectionist geolocation for information. How do you view it, Casper?
In many ways, I view it as a natural development of where Europe is, and sort of the ambitions of the European Commission to develop better digital skills, better digital capabilities in Europe. So Europe fit for the digital age, as we all know, is sort of the mantra of the European Commission. By the way, it's also the mantra, together with sustainability in the recovery plan, the EU next generation EU recovery plan with 750 billion euros in it. What I would say is, I think whether we talk about strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty, Gaia-X, I think the fundamental starting point here is that we all have to understand that Europe needs to catch up in this area. We have to make sure that we support entrepreneurs, startups, but also scaling companies in Europe so that they can benefit from the digital revolution. And again, if we look back at the last 7 months, I think it has illustrated very, very clearly that going digital is not something which is nice to, it's something which is absolutely needed to. We've probably seen 2-3 years of digitalization taking place in 2-3 months, and I think for some of us it felt like 2-3 weeks. And that has brought, I think, the fundamental understanding that it doesn't really matter whether you're in traditional manufacturing or whether you are an e-commerce company. Taking benefit of artificial intelligence or machine learning is going to be absolutely essential. We support Gaia-X. We think it is a natural step for Europe to develop, let's say, a federated system where you develop a marketplace where it will be easier for customers, for clients to perhaps switch between different products. I think our only plea in this, and Peter alluded to it already, is to make sure that for all actors, including a company like Microsoft, as long as we play by the rules of Europe, as long as we adhere to the European values, We hope that it doesn't matter where you come from, but rather how you play. And we would very much like to be part of providing state-of-the-art technologies to Europe to make sure that Europe will prosper, will recover as best as possible after COVID-19. So I think it's a natural development, but we also hope that sticking to European values, it also means that having an open market, level playing field with full competition will enable us to also continue to be an important player in Europe, supporting the companies across Europe. And here I just want to make one point clear. I think the business model that we have in Microsoft is really to provide what I would almost call sort of the critical infrastructure for enterprises across Europe. We don't own the data. We don't, in many cases, know what is happening on our platforms. It is something we're providing for companies to develop, to tailor-made it to their specific requirements. And I think that necessity will continue. And there, I think and hope that GAIA-X will play an important role.
Well, may I just add some remarks there, if I may? That is a good point, and that's why I said, we don't want to exclude anybody. I've just seen a recent letter by the heads of U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington D.C. addressed to our economic minister, Peter Altmaier, raising exactly these concerns. We want to be part of it. We have some concern that that we might not have access to that. The clear response from the German Minister for Economic Affairs is, I don't know if they have received this response letter already, but the response is and will be.
They will know it now.
Pardon? What?
They will know it now when you tell us what's in it.
Anyway, I've just seen it today. So, of course, it's not that anybody's excluded. It's exactly the way Casper is describing it. We want to have that. We want to make that an open infrastructure. We want to have a set of rules and regulations. Anybody who complies with this criteria is happy to participate. Actually, and the second thing that I wanted to say in that regard, I mean, it's not a exact comparison, but this discussion, these concerns, can we actually be part of it or are we excluded? Reminds me of the European Defense Fund, EDF. There have been letters and a lot of conversations and communication between the U.S. Pentagon and the European Commission saying, well, the Europeans are doing something there, and it feels like the U.S. Defense companies are excluded. It's very similar. As long as this set of rules and regulation is there and it's complied with, the American friends are very, very much welcome, and I might add on a personal needed.
This is a little bit related to defence, but also tying back to what Casper said regarding artificial intelligence and these highly developed technologies. I wonder, Casper, do you think that there needs to be better cooperation between the EU and the US on things like export control for so-called dual-use technologies around the world? I mean, we spoke earlier about similar values. How does it play into that? Things like the Wassenaar Agreement.
But the interesting thing is, if you had asked me the question, so can you point to a couple of areas on technology where the relationship or the collaboration is actually stronger than what you might get the impression of looking at the newspapers these days? And I would actually point to a couple of things. I mean, we might come back to cybersecurity because I think that's an area, unfortunately, which is the flip side of the coin as we digitalize our societies. We are seeing an increasing number of attacks that is, not only a theoretical threat, it's in fact also a physical threat and a threat against our societies, our economies, etc. But the other point that I will actually, give as an example is exactly what you alluded to, artificial intelligence. It was interesting that the US decided to sign up to a framework in the margins of the OECD on some principles for artificial intelligence. I think there is very strong collaboration also in looking at how do you make sure that you potentially regulate in high-risk areas around artificial intelligence, so in areas where, the algorithms would de facto take decisions that would have an eye impact on you. It could be in a judicial situation, it could be in healthcare, etc. I think those are areas where there is already a strong collaboration. These are super complex questions where getting regulation right is not as easy as it might sound. I think this is an area where there has to be closer collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. We want to make sure that we have our real experts our engineers participate in that so that we make sure that we go in where it's absolutely necessary, but we also do in a way that will not stifle innovation in Europe. And you might know that a number of European Union member states in the beginning of this month actually wrote an open letter, arguing to make sure that we have a light touch regulation around artificial intelligence. But there are areas where it will be necessary. One thing we've argued is when you look at facial recognition technologies, and you look at where that technology is today, it is indisputable that the possible misuse of these technologies exist. You have biases in the system where we know that people of color, or indeed women, the quality of those products are lesser for those than for others. And here we've argued that we might and we do need a set of guardrails around these technologies, so we make sure again that we adhere to fundamental human rights, protecting democracy, but also making sure that this really benefits the societies and the enterprises using these technologies. So I think there are a number of different areas where in fact we are closer to each other than we get the impression of listening to the news.
Well, we are anticipating a proposal on AI legislation from the European Commission at the beginning of next year. And do you think this risk-based approach is the right one, as indeed it was suggested by the German ministry? It seems a long time ago, but I think it was only the beginning of this year. Is that the right approach? Are they on the right track with that?
I think they are, and it's certainly also the same approach we've been putting forward. I think the devil is in the detail. It's about really defining what that means in practice and making sure that the high-risk areas are the right high-risk areas, and that we then discuss what does that mean, including for a company like Microsoft, as we develop our AI or ML systems. How do we make sure that our algorithms will be fully aligned with in this case European regulation or indeed US regulation.
Thank you. Now, Peter, I want to come back to this idea of the role of Germany. This is one of our presidency debates, and we are rattling through the German presidency at extremely high speed. It seems only yesterday it started, and we're already in approaching the end stages. How much can you achieve, really, in the 6 months that you have? And what is the role of Germany in a changing Europe? I'm thinking of things like Brexit, which is happening right now as well.
Okay, yeah, it's extremely challenging, and you're absolutely right. The presidency is only half a year, and obviously, in the main challenge, the main focus this time is fighting the pandemic and the recovery plan and all these things, and setting up the financial agenda for the next 7 years of the European Union. These are big things, and binding a lot of personnel also. But there's a whole set of topics that we put down on the list that we want to achieve. For example, because Casper mentioned that cybersecurity ordinance, we cybersecurity center, we want to have want to pass or present a set of rules and regulations for that, so to have a workable legal environment there. So there's really a number of things. But you mentioned Brexit. I mean, I was relieved, I have to say, to hear that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, in the very last second, more or less, agreed to continue the negotiations with the European Commission. I mean, as bad as it is that the Brits decided for leave, but that's real politics. We have to accept that. But we want, the German government currently, like other governments in the European Union, is trying to prepare also for a no-deal scenario. I mean, you have to do this, otherwise you would act irresponsibly. But again, also here's the devil is in the detail. We want definitely to achieve our presidency to have to have not a no-deal scenario. We know about the importance, and but it needs two to tango. It was not very helpful at all, and the House of Lords, the upper chamber of the UK Parliament, saw very similar. to pass this internal market bill in the UK, which could be seen as in violation of European treaties and so on. It's just not helpful. So it's good that Boris Johnson says we want to play a constructive role. And if you look to the details of what's being negotiated, where there's still no common ground really, and it's important issues, but it's about fishing in the Northern Sea, for example, in the North Sea, and some other things. It doesn't seem really that these 3-4 points where we could not have yet agreed cannot be really agreed on. So I have still some hopes, but also let's face it, time's running out, and not only the presidency of Germany in the EU, but also for the window of opportunity for it's only several weeks left to find an agreement with the Brits, and we have to prepare also for a transition phase without a deal scenario. So definitely, it is an ambitious agenda that we put down ourselves together in coordination with the other member states. But this special topic of Brexit and doing that right, it's not only up to us, obviously, but it's up to also to the British friends.
Well, with one of the larger member states, the UK, leaving the EU, does that mean that Germany will be in the spotlight a little bit more? Will we not be able to point the finger at the British neighbours for unpopular decisions?
Has that been in the past like that? Okay, you don't have to say anything. No, I mean, there will be, even without even in a no deal Brexit scenario, we will have a lot of relations, a lot of bonds, economically, defense, and many other things with the Brits. So the relation is super important and will remain. But yeah, I mean, of course, it will have consequences for us. Financial worlds, the economy, the defense architecture in Europe. Of course, I mean, it's important. And I don't know if it would make the world easier, or not so easy, and more uncomfortable for Germany to point with fingers to other friends. I don't really know if that has been practiced in the past so often. We are here really to politically lead, and you also do not have to forget that something is happening within my country next year as well. General elections are less than a year from now. We will have a German chancellor not running again, so there will be another personnel leadership in the German chancellery. And that is important not only for Germany, but also for issues like how do we cooperate and work together with our friends in the UK, but also in the rest of Europe and on a global scale. It is important. A lot of people are asking me, what comes after Angela Merkel? Is she will the successor also be committed to these issues? Will it be a political strong leader? Will it be somebody who will focus more domestically on? So that is not really trivial, and I can't answer that question myself, but it's important, and that's why it's also important to use this time of our presidency as efficiently as possibly, and that we try to implement and realize most, if not all, of the topics that we put down of our presidency agenda.
Casper, do you have an opinion on how the changing role of Germany within the EU might impact the transatlantic relationship?
I do, but perhaps more personal opinion than one representing Microsoft. But listen, I think there are two things that will be a consequence of Brexit. Many more, but let me just highlight two things. One is, of course, you have a country leaving the European Union that has always been enormously strong on the transatlantic relationship, being also a bridge builder for the collaboration with NATO. And we also have a country that has traditionally in the European Union been very focused on getting regulation right and making sure we don't over-regulate across the board, but certainly also in the areas of technology and digitalization. So that's one consequence. And I think the deduction of that is that, I don't want to be unfair to my good friend Peter here, but I do think a lot of us will look towards Germany, look towards Berlin for filling a little bit of that vacuum and making sure that Europe will head in the right direction, be loyal to the traditions, to the values, and perhaps also building alliances in Europe with some of the smaller progressive countries, the digital 9+ countries, I think are going to be incredibly important in this area. But I also think it means something for the industry if I just turn the spotlight towards us. I think one of the consequences of this is we have to do everything possible to make sure that we really fit into a European context. For us in Microsoft, that means tech fit for Europe. It means that we have to align our products, our technologies with what Europe wants, where Europe wants to go. If we look at a post-COVID-19 scenario, I think that means a lot of focus on job creation. It means a lot of focus on recovering the economy. It also means really making sure that our products are the gold standards on privacy, on security, etc., etc. So I think there are some things where we will look towards Germany and the German presidency, and not to stress you too much, Peter, but I do think you have an incredibly difficult but also incredibly important role to play in the next couple of months. But then I think also for the industry, we have to make sure that we do our part to help Europe progress in the right direction.
Well, thank you very much. I know we're approaching the end of our time, but since we started a little bit late, I hope you'll indulge me one final, slightly multifaceted question. We mentioned we have this 750 billion euros recovery fund. So my question is really, how do you spend it? How should we spend it? Where? And do we run the risk of getting finger pointing that it's subsidized, it's state aid from across the Atlantic? How should the EU be spending its money, given that we are in this unprecedented time? Peter, I'll let you respond first.
Don't take my word, really. The general answer would be we should allocate and spend these monies wisely in a smart way. And it's really seriously, I mean it. We need to overcome national interests more than in the past. That is so important for Europe, for the future of Europe. I have some concerns. We're talking so much about transatlantic relations, the current status and the tensions across the Atlantic and all this stuff. Sometimes when I talk about that, I'm much more concerned about the current status of the European Union. We let so much happen. We let the Belt and Road Initiative, put a wedge between us, 70+1 format. We have, a violation of European treaties by some of the member countries, and so on and so on. So all this money, this tremendous amount of money that nobody can really imagine how much that is, should really be spent in the interests of the common good. It sounds philosophically, but that is actually the guideline that should lead those who are making the decisions about this really huge amount. And we have talked a lot about transatlantic relations. We have talked a lot about technology. Technology certainly is top, really a top priority. But also, geopolitics is important. We have our neighboring continent to the south. It's Africa. We have a lot of responsibility there as well, not only because of colonialism, but refugees, migration, climate change, and so on. There's a huge task for us over here in Europe for the future, and definitely money will have to be spent there as well. It's too easy, but too stupid just to close borders. We need to do it the smart way and also in a humane way.
If you had 750 billion euros burning a hole in your pocket, how would you spend it?
Yeah, that'd be nice. And thanks for the question, because nobody called from the European Commission yet to ask that question. So thanks for giving me the opportunity. Listen, just to put it in context, 750 billion euros. When we look at the transatlantic relationship, that's a $1 trillion relationship in trade and services and goods on a yearly basis. That's $2.5 billion per day in transfer. So I think that sets a little bit the transatlantic partnership and the dependency we have across the pond into perspective. Anyway, my wish list, if I had 750 billion euros to spend, would be in three priority areas. One is access to broadband, rolling out the internet. We have seen also from COVID-19 that this doesn't hit equally. Those without access are hit much more hard. There is really a lack of inclusiveness in access to these new technologies. We see it at the regional level, we see it at the local level, and my understanding is that there's not a single country in Europe where you don't have problems with accessibility to internet and broadband. That is the I would say the foundation for the future economy, and we have to invest in that. By the way, that also applies for the private sector. The second area is related to that. I think skills and competences, we've also seen the importance of that. We need to invest more in the next generation, but we also need to invest more in those people that have been unfortunate to lose their jobs, or those that are looking at acquiring new digital skills for the digital economy. So that would be my second priority. And by the way, the Pact for Skills being launched by the European Commission in a few weeks, we think is a fantastic interface between the private sector and the European institutions. And then the last bit is what we've spoken about already. I think all of the above have to be done in a sustainable way, because as many others have said, we are in the middle of perhaps an unprecedented global pandemic, but we shouldn't lose sight of the next crisis looming around the corner. And I just think we have to invest massively in sustainability, biodiversity, water, etc. And again, I think that's a shared responsibility between the private sector and the public sector. So, Jennifer, those would be my three wishes for the 750 billion euros. And I'll give you my number in case they want to call and get that list more directly.
Thank you very much. Let's hope they're watching. We've reached our time. Thank you very much, Peter Bayer from the German Bundestag and Caspar Klinger from Microsoft. You've given us some glimmers of causes for hope, I think, in this discussion. We obviously couldn't get to half of the issues that are being raised in relation to the transatlantic relationship. We could take a whole afternoon discussing that, particularly, as you say, in these unprecedented times. But that doesn't mean that we can't still continue the conversation on social media. Do follow the hashtag EA Debates for more news and more discussion on the Euractiv presidency debates in association with Microsoft. Thank you again, gentlemen. Thank you for watching. This is going to be recorded, so you can check it out again online.